My interest in nuclear proliferation, I think, stemmed in part from this understanding that I had of the historic physics elements at the University of Chicago. Right? I mean, as I mentioned, the most prominent feature of physics, at least seen by the student who does not venture over into the various parts of the various physics buildings, is that statue, which is this representation of this monumental intellectual and engineering achievement of creating the world's first self-sustaining nuclear reaction. That is first human created. There have been some in mines in Africa a long time ago, and I think that it was partly that historical perspective and the knowledge of that history. In a sense, I think that many physicists sort of understand. I wouldn't quite put it as collective guilt, but perhaps collective responsibility for having created or been somehow, even if they weren't directly, obviously I wasn't directly involved in the creation of nuclear weapons, but that by virtue of being in the field of physics, we somehow bear some individual and collective responsibility for trying to manage the outcome of that creation. Well, Iraq is obviously the most egregious example in which some people in the intelligence community badly misinterpreted. It's embarrassing, actually, how badly they misinterpreted some information on certain aluminum tubes which were being shipped to Iraq. And it is actually a good example of why it is that people who are in policy should have a better physical understanding. There was a single analyst who was arguing that these particular tubes were indeed going to be used for centrifuges, despite numerous analysts from other agencies pointing out that in fact that the tubes were in fact inappropriate for it, and in fact were entirely appropriate for something which Iraq had been doing for years, which is to say making missiles and rockets in this case. And so it was an egregious policy mistake, not just because we got it wrong, but because it would have been so easy to get it right. The information was there. It was, more of a bureaucratic problem and also a motivated bias problem. Right? If you want to find something, you can find it in the data somewhere. But I think that anyone who had a significant amount of scientific training and was looking at the data from an as unbiased perspective as possible would have gotten it right. That's clearly the most egregious example. We've gotten. It's interesting in that out of all of the programs which we studied in this particular project, almost 9 of them we overestimated where they were. We tend to believe that countries are further ahead than they actually are, and this is particularly dangerous policy because it can lead to rash, not very well thought out policy decisions that we need to invade now or bomb now because they're getting really close to it. We found underestimation in 4 cases where we thought that they had not gone as far as they actually had, and we found in 2 cases that they had more or less gotten it right. The fact that we get it consistently wrong and in a fairly consistent direction over time seems to indicate that this is not simply some natural, well, you screw up sometimes, but that there is something more fundamentally wrong with intelligence gathering on nuclear weapons proliferation. President Obama has done something unprecedented, which is that he has made an explicit announcement and declared that it is his goal to get to 0 nuclear weapons. And while every president, up until George W. Bush, also supported this goal and to a certain extent, and even Bush supported it. It's just that there was more variation. He didn't support specifically the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is seen as one of the necessary steps along to it. Bush actually did a great deal towards disarmament. He did manage to push through a treaty with Russia, which had certain flaws having to do with how long the treaty would act for, which is a single day actually, as well as verification of it. But nonetheless, he did continue to push a disarmament agenda. There are fewer nuclear weapons now than there were when he started his presidency. Now, with respect to Obama, since he's made it such an important centerpiece, it's really unprecedented. It's interesting. Many policymakers and generals, after they get out of office, will often sign on to this idea of getting to zero nuclear weapons. So that's a huge step in the right direction. In renegotiating in the New START treaty, which is negotiated with Russia, is definitely a step in the right direction. It doesn't reduce forces as much as one could, but the important thing about New START was not necessarily how far it reduced it, but that it lays significant groundwork for future reductions, both by reestablishing a cooperative relationship with Russia and by establishing a monitoring and verification framework again, which was set to expire, which will be required for further reductions. And it also includes a number of details about counting rules, which are more precise and will pave the way for other reductions. And so while it would have been great if this initial step had reduced it more, I think that it's actually more important that rather than go for bigger cuts now is to really establish this as a norm and to lay an important foundation for future presidents or Obama himself to reduce them more significantly. I would say the one area which has been comparatively neglected, and this has been a sticking point for a very long time, so it's unsurprising, is in the area of tactical nuclear weapons, which is just somewhat a distinction without a difference in that a tactical one is one you put on a plane and fly a short distance and drop it, and a strategic one is one that you put on a plane or a missile and have it go a long way before it explodes. But the strategic weapons we have agreements about, and the tactical ones we don't. And that's a clearly significant area which will need to be addressed, especially as we get closer to zero. Formerly, the strategic weapons far outnumber the tactical ones as the counting rules go, and so this is less important, but it will become more important and does need to be addressed.